So yeah, hi everyone, welcome to this event. For those that don't know, Al Garthwaite is one of the organisers of the Reclaim the Night marches in Leeds back in 1977. So we wanted to invite Al here today to speak about the work she has and continues to do in making the streets safer for women. So today she'll be joining us to talk about her work in relation to Reclaim the Night and activism for the women's rights movement over the years. So after Al's talk, we will have some time for discussion. So please feel free to use the chat function to put your question in there, or let us know that you have a question and you can turn on your camera to ask the question to Al. And we will also be hearing from your welfare officer, Sophia, who's here on some of the work she's been doing in relation to tackling sexual violence. But yeah, I think that was everything for the introduction. So I will happily pass over to Al to start with her talk. But yeah, if you have any questions that come up, just pop them in the chat and we'll come to it at the end. So thanks, Al.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here. Well, I'm in my house, but you know, we're all together on the screen. And I thought I'd start by saying a little bit about myself, my childhood growing up, and what I did before I got involved in the women's liberation movement in early 1970s. So my father was in the army. We moved around throughout my childhood, and my mother didn't have paid work, but she was very active on charity committees and organising fundraising events for the charities. And my father, indeed, when he was retired, got involved in local activities such as the Churchyard Care Committee or the British Legion. So my background was that you did that sort of thing voluntarily in your own time, although what they did and what I then ended up doing were rather different, given that they were Conservatives and I'm, well, Labour now, Labour councillor. So, and it's also about seeing a need and working to do something about it, seeing something wrong and wanting to change it or to make things better for people. And I think that's a sort of guiding principle, really, that has brought me through the movement, being a trade unionist and all other things. But here I'm focusing on what I've done in the women's liberation movement and my activism for women's rights. Growing up back in the 1950s, pretty grim, expectations for girls very low. I think for some girls it hasn't really changed. The 5 C's summed it up: caring, clerking, cashiering, cleaning and cooking. And then for a girl such as myself, secretary. Every single careers talk I had, secretary, you must be a secretary. You know, and my mother thought that would be good because then I could meet a boss and marry him, and that would be great, you know. But it wasn't really what I wanted to do. It was still a time I can remember when married teachers, if they got married, had to leave the profession. Women working in the civil service, if they got married, had to leave. Of course, married women carried on working in factories and other caring roles that women did work, but there was many fewer. But of course, when the 1960s came along and the social movements and protest movements that had been going for some time resulted in social changes such as the Race Relations Act, homosexual law reform. So it was no longer illegal for men to have a gay relationship if they were consenting adults over 21. And abortion law reform. So it became, it was more possible to get an abortion for an unwanted pregnancy. So I had begun to think a lot of this wasn't fair. And I think, like all girls growing up, sexual harassment becomes an issue, from wolf whistling, catcalling, comments on the street, attempted groping, lots of that. And a rather unpleasant experience when I was 17, in a sports car, but fortunately the man was very hampered by the fact it was a sports car and he was the driver, and I was wearing a long dress, so I was able to jump out before anything further happened. But the thing was, at the time I didn't tell anyone about that. We had no language to talk about it. It was just a sort of incident, and I was brought up with, I should ignore it. And I think that was, you know, wolf whistling or men exposing themselves. Ignore it. And ignoring something doesn't make it go away. And as for the more direct sexual attack, it just wasn't something that was really talked about very much, not in when I was growing up anyway. So that didn't seem to be right. I got into university, which only 10% of people did at the time. So I was very pleased to achieve that. Although I went to Durham, and it's a bit like the Oxbridge system. You have to be part of a college there. And there were 3 women's colleges and 11 men's colleges. So there were fewer women, obviously, unless you wanted to do teacher training, in which case there were 2 women's teacher training colleges and 1 men's. And there I discovered a lot more about general sexism, but was very active in demonstrating against the Vietnam War at the time. And I do remember I was doing English literature and psychology, and I remember in my American literature module, we had to all choose a book and talk about it like you do in a seminar. And one man chose one, I can't remember its name, where basically it was entirely about the main male character raping. So everywhere he went, he raped. And this was meant to be funny. And I thought at the time, this isn't right. And those of us women students in the room said nothing. And some of the men sniggered. And he read out some really horrible bits. And the tutor who was taking it did nothing. It was just like, oh, here's a work of American literature. I've never come across that book since. I'm sure it's not in any sort of literature. So that was unfortunately how things were. So moving on, I graduated and went to live in Oxford. And the first job, I went for a job that I really wanted, a small firm. I was 22 and the boss was only 26. And he said to me, what salary would you like? So I named a figure. And he said, oh no, I could get a man for that. So I said, I didn't think it should make any difference, which luckily he quite liked my answer. I did get the job. But that spurred me on. And in the newspaper that weekend, I read about something called the Women's Liberation Workshop in London. So I thought this sounds like something I would like to be part of. So I wrote off and got a newsletter back and information about groups to join. So I did go along to a group. And around that time, that group was campaigning for a nursery on an estate in Oxford. So I joined in the campaign, and then the National Women's Liberation Movement was formulating demands at that point. What did we stand for? So it started off with 4 demands, and then eventually there were 7. So it was equal pay, because unequal pay was totally accepted at the time. Equal education and job opportunities, which I have to say that some of the unions were very against. You couldn't get into printing, for example, if you're a woman. The printers union, no, it's for men, and that's that. Free contraception and abortion on demand. Free 24-hour nurseries, because childcare was seen, nurseries were really seen, state nurseries, as something for women who couldn't cope very well. And there were a few others which you could pay for, but really the model was mothers of young children stay at home, basically, or take them to playgroup. Then there was everyone's right to legal and financial independence, because again, at the time, a woman couldn't get a mortgage on her own without a man signing, and certainly not as a married woman. You couldn't get credit to buy something, you had to have a man's signature. And if you were married, your husband would fill in your tax returns. He would know all about what you might earn. You didn't have to know what he earned, he would know what you earned, because you were just subsumed into his financial and legal existence. And also, this came slightly later, I think it was 74, an end to discrimination against lesbians. And that was something that was quite controversial at the time, because some women said, oh, they all say we're lesbians anyway, so we mustn't put something in writing saying an end to discrimination against lesbians, because it'll just make it more difficult to get the other things we want. But that point of view was not widely held, and it went through at the National Conference. But there was a lot of very overt discrimination. I used to, one of the things I did was put on organised travelling theatre groups. And we often went to the then Trades Club in Leeds to put them on. It had a very good hall and a bar and everything. So there was a group called Gay Sweatshop, very good, very professional. And I wanted to put on their play on lesbian mothers. So I rang up the Trades Club. And as soon as I'd explained what it was about, no, I don't want to know. No, you can't have that here. And so I said, well, why not? Why not? And she just put the phone down. That was, it was a old style couple of communists who were really very nice, but no, anything like that, wouldn't have it. So we ended up putting it on in a room above a pub, and we got an audience, you know, we did come. But of course, at that time, being a lesbian, and particularly if you were someone who'd been married or in a relationship with a man and you had children, and then the relationship broke up and you went off with, you started a relationship with a woman, the man would automatically get custody of the children in court. I mean, didn't have to look at, is this man a suitable father? Is she a good mother? Anything. No, she's a lesbian, therefore she's totally unsuitable. The man gets custody. End of. Which, going ahead a bit, is something that we started challenging a lot in the 1980s, and I was on the production side of making a film for Channel 4 called Breaking the Silence, all about the lives of lesbian mothers. And by the end of the 80s, that had really stopped. But of course, a lot of lesbian women who would have liked to have children didn't even start thinking you have children, because you just think if that's the atmosphere, you're not, you know, it's not something you should do. It's not right, and the child would suffer. So, and then finally, that added demand, the final demand was added in 1978, an end to violence against women. And that, I think, had really been an issue that had been brewing throughout the 70s, but it took till then to do it, because of course at the beginning of the 1970s, if you were a woman experiencing domestic abuse and violence, there were no refuges, there were no helplines. You could go to the police and they would say, we don't want to interfere between a man and his wife, or they'd say it's just a domestic. And so if the police were called because there was a lot of noise in the house or something, I mean, if the woman was really badly injured, she might be taken to hospital, you might get an ambulance. But if not, they'd say, oh yes, well, quieten down, you're disturbing the neighbours, and off they would go. So I'm sorry, my cats are doing terrible things and I've got to stop whatever's happening. No.
We have a lot of cats in LUU, so don't worry, we're used to it.
Yes, I don't know what they're up to. So, so in our women's liberation groups, by then I'd moved to Leeds, incidentally. I moved to Leeds in 1973 and joined the Women's Liberation Group in Leeds. And pretty soon we broke into different smaller groups by locality, and had a various activities there. And in our group, we were looking particularly at women's health, and we started a women's health course, because at the time, the medical establishment was very male dominated indeed, and really treated women like idiots. So you were not told anything. And childbirth had become very, very sort of medicalized, away from the old midwife model into hospital. And if you had a baby, it was feet up in stirrups in a sort of dead insect position. It was a really bad situation. And also a lot of bad things went on, of harassment by doctors as well, with there were no rules like a nurse. I should have been, but I remember going thinking I had a lump in my breast, and just saw the male doctor on my own, who then, well, he had to feel around, so obviously he did, but there was no nurse in the room or anything, and then just proceeded to stand there and witter on with his hands still firmly clamped for ages, which was, you know, unnecessary. So there's all the sorts of little things that happen in life, which I'm sure happen to everybody, which just build up in the end to an overpowering sense of rage, which has to get an outlet. And so, yes, we started organising groups of women to do something about the situation of women who are experiencing domestic abuse, and started, we're able to squatted a house in a terrace in Leeds 6, I think, around 1974, 75. I remember the headline in the Yorkshire Evening Post, "A freezing squat is home for wives," it said, with a whole lot of women sitting in one room. And, you know, it was the best we could do because there was no funding or anything. It was women doing this in our own time. And this was happening all over the country at that point. And in the end, funding did come, but it was a long and uphill struggle. And around the same time or slightly later, the issue of rape was receiving the same sort of attention, because again, at that time, if you were raped, unless you fell into a very particular category, basically you got a most hideous time at the police station if you went in to report. You were just not believed, and you were questioned as if you were a suspect completely. I mean, it's not that great in courts these days, but police stations have improved. But it was appalling. So the vast majority of women who got raped did not report it at all. And who could blame them? And the things that the police said, I remember a woman, I was working on an internal newsletter for the women's liberation movement at the time. And for the lack of anything else, sometimes women who'd had a bad time would come into our office and just tell us about things. And this one woman coming in, she'd been walking home from a party in her mid-40s, and suddenly a late teenage boy had sprung upon her and rape occurred. And the police said, "Oh, well, you must have wanted it." And, you know, no, it was just ridiculous. And then she told us about the terrible time she'd had. And that was really common. And that's also not thinking about the sexual harassment that continued to go on the street. So this rage was really building up. And also, we're now into 1977, and I lived in Chapeltown at the time, and those of us there had become aware that there was a serial killer of women around. And we now know that there was probably a lot more women who'd been injured by Peter Sutcliffe, and indeed quite possibly killed, than was known at the time. But at the time we knew there were, I think, 3 women. And so we read in Spare Rib magazine about a group of women in Germany who'd got fed up with being harassed by men on a particular night of the year called Walpurgisnacht, when young men had taken to going out in groups and basically harassing women in the street. So they said, we're going to take back the night, we're going to reclaim the night. And they went out in groups a few days later and just said, we're not putting up with this anymore. So we thought, what a good idea. And then let's have one ourselves. And then we thought, well, how about writing to other women's centres, women's liberation groups, advertising in the internal newsletter, and seeing whether other groups of women in different towns and cities across the country would have one all on the same night. So we wrote our letters, and letters came back, and that was how we communicated. If you had a phone, you were lucky, landline, obviously. And so we agreed on a date, the 12th of November, 1977, and indeed on that night, at least 12 events, Reclaim the Night events, took place in different parts of the country. And it's all the January edition of January 78 edition of Spare Rib magazine, which is online, I think, gives an account of all that. And in Leeds, we were two groups, basically based on where we lived. One group set off from Chapeltown Community Centre and the other group from Hyde Park Corner, because then, as now, there were problems with Woodhouse Moor for women. So we marched down the street. I was in the Chapeltown group, being that I lived in the area. And we shouted slogans, however we dress, wherever we go, yes means yes, no means no. And women unite, reclaim the night. And we had flaming torches. I don't know where I found out how to order them, but I did, and I wrote off and they arrived. And the streets were fairly empty at the time. It was different from these days where there's a lot of nightlife, particularly into the city centre, apart from COVID times. So we went towards the city centre and we gave out leaflets to any passers-by who looked at us with amazement, because it was so completely different from the way people thought that women should behave. It was like a fact of nature or life that women would not demand to be safe on the streets, even though women were obviously going out to work, to evening classes, to study, to have a drink with friends, whatever. It was unimaginable to people that you would complain that it was difficult and dangerous, and you might feel alarmed by it. And it was good when we went along North Street. It was 11 o'clock at night and men were coming out of the Eagle pub, and they saw the women passing by and being a bit drunk. They came towards us, oh, get you, sort of thing. And so we advanced on them with our flaming torches and they shrank back. It was really good. And so we met the other group, had a rally in City Square, which was just us at 11:15 at night, which again is hard to imagine these days. And then we'd laid on transport, so no one had to walk home alone. And I think at the time we thought, well, that was really good. And now what's the next thing we're going to do? I certainly never realised that, however many years on, 44 years on, there'd still be Reclaim the Nights marches or Reclaim the Streets, and still this bad need for them, obviously. But of course, we all knew that we didn't just have to fear Peter Sutcliffe. There were many, many other men around who would do things. And so we did continue to campaign against violence against women. We saw a link between the sort of pornography that at that time was sold in sex shops, because of course there was no internet. Well, there was, but it was the American military who didn't have access to it. And we saw that a lot of it was really, for some men who would read it, it would encourage them to think that sexual violence against women was okay, and that was how relationships should be, and that was how sex was. There was also immense double standards. So if you were, as a woman, going out for a drink or whatever, and then something bad happened, there was, oh, well, why were you there in that place at that time, wearing what you were wearing, having had a drink? It must be your fault. And yet if a man went out and something happened, and things do happen to men, I would never deny it, young men are actually most likely to get physically attacked, though not sexually attacked, if out and about at night. It was just, oh, well, that's really unfortunate, and poor you, and that's terrible. Whereas for women, it was your fault. And I remember going on the radio and being interviewed by Radio Leeds, and they'd chosen a rather old-fashioned, even for the time, Conservative councillor from Bradford to speak as well. And she was firmly of the opinion and actually said, nice girls don't get raped. And she said, I've never had any trouble. And that made me think of rather unkind responses, but, it was really bad, and that was very, very standard. You know, I'm a respectable woman, I go all over the place, I've never had any trouble, there must be something wrong with you, i.e. me, all the other women. So I think, I mean, those women were in denial, but it was really bad. And that was such a common view, and I don't really think you hear that these days, at least I haven't heard it. There was also a terrible double standard in terms of the way the media was reporting the women killed by Peter Sutcliffe. So if they were or thought to be involved in sex work and prostitution, then that was much less important. And in a way, they'd got what was coming to them in terms of the way it was covered by the media. If they were seen as a different sort of woman, then that was a completely different story. And I even remember something really offensive being said, that this is so shocking, now an innocent woman has been killed. It's absolutely appalling, that sort of division between women. And really, I think the media did carry on that way. And it wasn't until that murderer killed the women in Ipswich in the early noughties that the media coverage started to shift and to be shown that these were women who were mothers or daughters and friends and nieces, and actually women, as opposed to some category of woman that was less important, which is obviously disgraceful, but something that we campaigned about a great deal. It took longer to organise a march or any event or a vigil in those days, or because we didn't have social media and quite a lot of us didn't have phones. So we had a telephone tree where I lived in a house of women and children, and there were 3 others, I think. So we were at the top of the tree because it was likely that someone would be in if someone rang up and announced there was going to be an event the next day or 2 days' time or that night or whatever. And then I would ring, or whoever was written in my house would ring 3 other numbers and go around the corner to tell a house of women who weren't on the phone, and so on. So the tree went down, and in the end you got women who weren't on the phone, and someone would be going around to put a note through their door or tell them what was going on. So it did take time, but it worked. So the Peter Sutcliffe's reign of terror continued, and in Leeds we had further Reclaim the Night marches, which attracted more and more women each time, not the little groups of 30 that had been to start with. And the one just after Jackie Hill was killed in November 1980, as she was walking up Alma Road towards Lupton Flats at 9 o'clock at night. And that attracted, there were 600, 700, there were loads, masses. We overflowed City Square. And we were really angry. We were really angry with the way that the police was treating the whole situation, as if it was a contest between the police and this one man who was mythologized by the name of the Yorkshire Ripper. And I don't like these nicknames given to serial murderers. It sort of makes them into mythic figures almost, and they're not. It's just Peter Sutcliffe. And at Elland Road Football Club as well, the football crowds used to chant "Police 12, Ripper 12, Police 0," and sing "There's only one Yorkshire Ripper." It was chilling. And the police as well were not listening to what the women survivors of Peter Sutcliffe said, that he was a local man, that he was quite small, that he was dark, etc. They believed this man who'd sent in a tape from the northeast, who started "I'm Jack," and he had a Geordie accent, and they said, "This is who we're looking for." So they actually questioned Peter Sutcliffe 9 times, but never actually went to his house and found the evidence. And it took uniformed police to pull him up for a traffic offence to actually catch him in the end in Sheffield. So it made us very, very angry indeed. And effectively, women were operating under a curfew because the police reaction, and the Vice-Chancellor of Leeds University at the time said, women stay in after dark. Well, the dark in November in Leeds, it's about 18 hours long. And men were still, oh yes, men, you can go out and about, do what you wish. But no, women were told that. And still to this day, that gets said, women must stay in. Don't do this, don't do that, don't go there, don't do this. Whereas men aren't stopped if they're going out and about in this place or that place or lurking somewhere. They're just able to do that. So various spray painting appeared around the city with curfew on men written down, and women against violence against women and other such slogans. And I've talked to a female police officer since who was totally understood what was going on. And she said that a lot of her male colleagues literally didn't understand what we were talking about. It was just incomprehension that we wanted to change the way things were. Like, to them, you know, you have to drink water or you die of thirst. Well, women have to stay in at night or else. It was just a fact of life. And it took a long time to change that. But gradually, the local Leeds City Council was listening at last. We got a women's committee and I was a representative on it, representing, well, against violence against women. And we decided to have a conference, which was a Crimes Against Women conference. And that was very good, with workshops. It was held at the College of Technology at the time. And despite a Conservative councillor who used to go around, come to our events, and she would be on the lookout for lesbians. And she would then talk to the Yorkshire Evening Post and say, I saw women kissing and cuddling at this conference. And then that would be their headline, lesbians at conference, as opposed to lots of women talked about rape and what we could do about it, or sexual harassment, or what it might be. But she was a bit of a joke, but it was still really annoying. And the fact that the Yorkshire Evening Post thought that was acceptable, you know, fine to say that. But anyway, a very senior police officer came to the Crimes Against Women conference, and he was asked, do you have a specially trained unit of police officers who will receive reports of rape and know how to deal with them properly, and ideally women police officers? And he said, oh yes, yes. Well, he didn't, I was told, then in the March, but he did by the July. So that was the start of better treatment in that direction. Although the courts, as we know, still have a long way to go, and so do juries to this day. Juries don't like convicting someone of rape. Well, they don't like convicting a young white middle-class male student. They don't like convicting a respectable looking family man, especially if he's white. You know, it's not just the Crown Prosecution Service that's reluctant to bring cases of rape to court. It's also knowing how juries behave, and we've got a long way to go still. So we turned our attention to campaigning that rape in marriage should be a crime, because at that time a man could rape his wife with impunity and it wouldn't be rape. It would, you know, whether she wanted it or not, it was he had rights over her body. And so we were out collecting signatures on petitions on the streets, writing to MPs, lobbying. And finally, in 1994, that became a crime. Now, it's not something that many women have taken their husbands to court about, although it has happened. But the fact it's a crime, and that's known, has a very significant effect. And of course, in lots of countries to this day, that is not a crime. A married man has rights over his wife. So over over the time, by this time, I'd, with other women, set up a small production company. And one film that we made in the year 2000 was Never Give Up Against Violence Against Women in West Yorkshire, which charts the 30 years of campaigning against violence against women and the gradual change in which it became more and more mainstream. And we also made one called Yorkshire Women of the Century, about women's achievements in Yorkshire over the century. Because if you count the blue plaques in Leeds that the Civic Trust puts up in memory of whoever, there's many more men than women. And I'm now part of a group we're calling us Forgotten Leeds Women, to redress that imbalance. There's a Forgotten Women of Wakefield group that have done a lot of work in that respect. And this can only be encouraged. And the City Council got a women's committee and funded a lot of International Women's Day events. So things were changing through the 80s. Through the 70s, it was groups of us in our own homes, maybe a community centre, organising and campaigning. By the 80s, we had more mainstream support. I'm not saying it was all plain sailing, it wasn't, but it was better. And in terms of men's reaction, I think we still get today men saying it's not all men. Well, we know it's not all men. It's obvious it's not all men, but they would keep saying it. But a lot more used to say it. As soon as you said something like, we get afraid if a man is following us at night, but it's not all men. No, we know that. The problem is we don't know whether that's one of you, not all men, or whether it is actually the man who's going to do us harm. And this is the problem we face. Around this time, Reclaim the Night marches were really carried on by women's or equality officers in universities. And that was really good in Leeds, and I was asked to go and speak at a few in Bradford, in Lancaster, in Manchester, and that kept it alive, the movement, I think, in the 90s. And I remember in Bradford, I think she was the equality officer, had a very bad time. By a group of men had come and said, well, men get attacked, why isn't there a march for us? So she said, fine, no problem. I will organise it for you. I will ensure that there is funding. Tell me when you want to have it. Let's work together. Well, of course, they didn't want it. They slunk off. It was just what they said. And when we started that march, there was a group of the rugby team, it does go by stereotypes sometimes, had got very drunk and were shouting at us. But, you know, we walked around the campus on that occasion and in fact got a very good response from the public. Because the public were changing. They were beginning to understand what it was all about at that point. I was also active in my union. It was the media union. And we were looking at really extending the sort of support that you could give to women experiencing domestic violence. So rather than just say, well, here's a refuge, you know, or training the police of how to deal with it, there's things that you can do at work to support women who are experiencing domestic abuse or violence at home. And there was an example, there was a woman who worked in the body shop in London, and you know the body shop, it often has its doors wide open, and the woman was in the shop serving customers and her ex came in and killed her there and then in the shop. So the body shop then became really quite pioneering on the issue of violence against women and supported a big conference that was held in Brighton in 1996, an international conference against violence against women, which was attended by 2,500 women from 137 different countries. And it really was amazing. It went on for 6 days. It was something none of us will ever forget. I organised the showing of films on that, and some of them were more mainstream and some of them had been smuggled out of their countries on videotape. There was one called Russia Women Rape, I remember, that had been smuggled out, and another about violence against women in Turkey. And so it was a real mixture and quite roughly made, but very powerful. But going back to the media union, there was another example that I knew of a woman working as a sound recordist, and she'd left her partner, was living on her own, but he wanted revenge. So he looked at the credits on the television until he found one that where she was credited as the sound recordist. He then rang up the production company and said, pretended to be from another production company because she was a freelancer, and said, oh, we don't have a contact address for so-and-so, and we need to send her a check, because that was how it was then, in payment. And so the production company office gave him the address. He lay in wait for her, and when she came home that night, he put her in hospital for a week. So there's a lot that workplaces can do and understand about confidentiality. And the banking union was very good on that, and promoted to its female employees that if they were experiencing something like that, they didn't have to be at the cash desk. They should be transferred to a job behind the scenes. And if it was something like a bank of Lloyd's, where there's branches everywhere, they could arrange a transfer to it so that the woman would keep her job. Because I think people didn't think that women experiencing domestic violence would actually have jobs and want to keep them. And of course, it's key, it's really important. And so there were quite a lot of things put in place around that as well. And also appealing to, I suppose, the private sector's focus, which is money and profit, which is that you've spent a lot of money training this woman, why leave her? You know, why let her leave? And if she starts, if she's turning down further training opportunities, saying she has to go home every night at a certain time, if her husband or partner is always there waiting for her, that's something to look at, and something could perhaps be said. And there's things that can be put up in the women's toilets and so on, posters. So all this sort of thing, which I think is very important. And similarly, sexual harassment, which is rife in many workplaces, and certainly in the media industry. I knew of, I remember a woman saying at a conference that she was an assistant editor, and at one point she'd made some mistake, or the editor said she'd made some mistake in the edit suite, and he put her across his knee and spanked her. I mean, for goodness sake, the things that happen. So all these things. So really moving on, Reclaim the Night started becoming not just something that was done in universities around the early noughties, when Finn Mackay in London founded the London Feminist Network and then had a Reclaim the Night march. And that was 60 of us at the time. But after a few years, it became, well over 1,000, 2,000. And it started up in lots of different towns and cities again across the country. The last one we had in Leeds, apart from recent events, was 2018, I think. And at that, the Lord Mayor spoke. And that would never have happened back in 1977. You wouldn't have had, the Lord Mayor was a woman in 2018. You wouldn't have the Lord Mayor speaking. I want to finish fairly soon, but I'll just say a little bit about what we're doing now and what I've done as a Labour councillor, because I know I've been going on for quite some time. So when I became a councillor 5 years ago, I thought, what can I do to further being against male violence against women? And I instituted training for bar and club staff in the city centre and Headingley and Hyde Park to recognise and deal appropriately with incidents or reports of sexual violence or partner abuse. And that was really spurred on by something that somebody told me, where she'd been in a bar and she was standing with her boyfriend. The boyfriend was off somewhere, gone to the toilet or something. And she was at the bar and a man came up from behind her and put his hands right on her breast. So she turned around and said, "How dare you, you know, what do you think you're doing?" you apologise. He said, no, why should I apologise? You're here, you're on your own, you must be up for it. So she was furious, and then boyfriend turned up and he apologised to the boyfriend. So they were both furious. So they complained to the bar staff and said, we want to get the police. And the bar staff said, oh, no, we don't want any trouble here. We don't want any trouble. You know, he's gone away now. It's all stopped. Let's worry about it further. Well, they did call the police, and actually the police came and they were very good. But by then the perpetrator had long gone. So I thought, well, we badly need training for staff. So that started to happen, not during COVID, because obviously the hospitality industry is happening, but it will start again. And also I got it extended to taxi drivers, because they see a lot in their cabs and they need to know what to do about it, who to ring, not just let things happen. And I've personally had a bad experience in a cab that I shared mistakenly. It's not an unknown occurrence, whether it's domestic abuse with partners going back to the same house or elsewhere. Hotels is another thing. There's been a few instances, I found this extraordinary when I heard it, of women who've gone out for the night, separated from their friends perhaps, or just got in a conversation with a man and rather drunk. And the man has then said, oh, I'll find you a taxi, or let's go back. Oh, sorry. Sorry, I thought I turned it off. And then actually booked into a hotel in the perimeter of the city centre, and has not been asked for identity or proof of identity or both their names or anything, just given a name. And in one case, he actually said, I'm here with my daughter and we want a double bed. And would you believe they got it? It's unimaginable. So obviously hotels is something that is going to get really looked at after that. And there have been also quite a few reports by women who went to a hotel with their partner, but then afterwards have reported violence to the police, abuse or violence. And that again is about hotels being more aware, having, I don't know, patrols, having posters up, just generally everyone knowing what to look out for. So, and also saying, if you're in trouble, ring reception or ring this number, not waiting until the day after and the woman's then had to go to the police. So other things that have come up, some of you know about this, but the Ginnell by Headingley Stadium, when the report came in of the sexual assault there was obviously a lot of concern. And we've now had the foliage, or the head high and slightly higher foliage, cut right back. So you can actually see through. I mean, it's got a little bend, but you can see through. CCTV has gone up. The lights have got a brighter luminescence. The Leeds Rhinos Foundation, when weather permits, which is next month really, have funded the painting of a mural, which we want a woman to paint. We're looking for women street artists, something really powerful and feminist. And also we'll clean off all the graffiti and put anti-graffiti paint on, because all that graffiti tends to feel a bit lawless. The uppermost foliage is the final thing. And some of the people who have gardens that back onto the stadium, they actually want quite thick trees because it protects them from the arc lights in the stadium and also the noise. But what I'm going to try and persuade them to do is just cut it back so it's level with their fences rather than overarching. And if someone is prepared to do that but doesn't have the money, we can look at, because it's expensive, that stuff, we can look at it. The stadium cut back. We have to remind them sometimes, but they do cut back. So that's the sort of thing we want to see. We've had, I'm going to, tasking group on sexual harassment in the city centre is being set up. We want men to join the White Ribbon campaign, and some of our male councillors have already done that and become ambassadors. This is really the way forward for men, never to condone, commit, or remain silent in the face of violence against women. We don't want them taking over what we might be doing. We want them talking to men. And our head of waste management, which is a very male-dominated service, you know, the bins and everything, he's got a lot of good ideas about making videos to show to all the staff there, and having a message on the outside of the wagons. I don't know what it'll be, wagon against violence against women, but something, so that and we've got a group going so that we can really get this going across the whole authority. And I'm sure there are lots of other ideas. I'd like to see government making misogyny a hate crime so that sexual harassment on the street can be dealt with. I'd like to make them see curb crawling, not just curb crawling a woman or girl for sex, to pay for sex is a crime, but not tailing a woman in a car, which happens. If that was made, if a man who did that lost his license, I think they'd stop, or they'd think twice, and so on. So I'm sure you've all got lots of ideas, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you're doing as well. Sorry, I've gone on longer than I, much longer. No. I hope you haven't found it really boring.
Definitely not. You've obviously got a lot of experience, and yeah, your stories are insane. And thank you so much for all the work you've done, you know, for the women's liberation movement. It's incredible and so fabulous to hear. And the current work as well, the recent work is amazing to hear about the Guinnell, because I know a lot of students were concerned about that. So it's amazing to hear that that's kind of yeah, had some improvements. I will just read out Daisy, who had to leave us, but they've put a nice comment in the chat that I'll just read out to you all. She's put, "You are truly inspirational. Thank you for all you've done and are still doing. What a shame it's still an issue. As Noam Chomsky, I think that's how you say it, recently said, it's at least easier to protest these days. So sadly, we just have to suffer, meaning we should all continue to campaign. Again, thank you." So that's a nice comment there from Daisy.
Thank you.
So yeah, so if anyone else has any questions or just comments, please feel free to use the chat box. I know I've got a question, so I can kick us off. I just wanted to ask Al, to what extent you think the media, I know you mentioned it previously in your talk, plays a part in this. You know, we see a lot of news titles saying, you know, woman murdered by, but it's never, you know, the man murdered, and that simple wording it makes such an impact on how people perceive it. And also there's been some news articles around, you know, TV shows such as The Fall and Line of Duty, and how much of a reoccurrence, you know, women, and how accepted it is and normalized it is for, you know, women being murdered within those TV shows. Do you think that has some part to play in, you know, in how, you know, sadly we are still seeing Reclaim the Night movement still happening these days?
I totally agree. I'm sure it has.
Yeah.
And somehow they don't learn. But I know that I don't know if any of you read Val McDermott, crime fiction. I think she's really good. But she's really feminist, but she always used to have women being murdered, and she's been called out on that. And she's said, yes, you've got a point. I can see that this is not necessarily good, trying to change it. Yeah. And the same with the media as well. But they do it. I mean, it's been going on for years. I remember back in the 80s, the Yorkshire Evening Post had put a picture of, they put a report of a woman being murdered right next to a sort of scantily dressed young woman. And it was just really offensive. So 3 of us walked into the Yorkshire Post building and just said, we've come to see the editor, and walked straight through. I don't think you could do that these days. And said to him in his office, stop doing this. And he was he was astounded because he couldn't see what was wrong with it at all. And the salacious way in which the murder was reported, because it was a sexual murder, and then this picture of a woman in her underwear right next to it. It was just horrible.
Away from the actual action, I guess. And yeah,
yes.
it's awful. And yeah, I agree. I think they have a huge part to play in all of this. And it's like you said, taking accountability and improving, at least, that writer is trying to do that. But I think we're yet to see that from the media. In taking accountability. We've got another question, great question from Maisie, who said, I know you mentioned about the hospitality industry and staff training. What do you think about the proposal of undercover police officers in culture spaces? So, for example, nightclubs. Do you feel that is counterproductive?
It's an interesting question, and it's one we've been debating a lot recently. I think that they should be women, basically, any undercover police officers, because they are going to be much more able to know if there's predators about. And basically I think we have to shift the focus, which is still there, from protecting women to get the predators. And then it's, how do you get the predators? And I know that they did something like this in Newcastle. They called it Operation Cloak. Oh, that's my clock again. And it was actually very successful. And I know my daughter went to Lancaster University. So it's a campus university. The campus is 4 miles out of town. And it's, I don't know if you know that area, but north of Lancaster, it's basically rural Cumbria. And every year, Freshers' Week, a lot of men would come down to Lancaster from rural Cumbria, specifically to see if they could grab women who were going out into the town from the campus and then walking back. And it was an extremely deliberate, organised thing that they did. I don't think Leeds works quite that way, but maybe it does. But certainly it was the case in Lancaster that the police knew, the university authorities knew, and they warned about. So I do think we have to find a way of looking out for predators,
yeah,
and catching them. I mean, what does anyone think? Is it a good thing, or how else do we do it?
Yeah, any suggestions or comments on your own thoughts on that would be great to hear and discuss. But whilst we wait, perhaps for some people to send in their thoughts on that, or feel free to put your hand up as well if you want to come in on it. But yeah, I'll move on to another question that we have. So this is from Nicola. She said, so can I ask what steps will be taken to work with secondary schools given the recent reports of sexual harassment in schools, so that everyone's invited webpage? That's what she's referenced there.
Yes, I think it is already there in the curriculum. And my daughter, who went to Lancaster, is now a high school teacher, not in Leeds. And she brings it up under sex and relationships education, or personal sex and relationships, whatever it was called. But what she says is it's very much in the past, it's very much depended on the teacher, their level of awareness, how comfortable they are in talking about things. I mean, she'll talk about things like female genital mutilation and despite the class saying, oh, no, miss, don't talk about this, it's horrible. But she will, because she thinks it's important. But some teachers would totally not be able to cope with talking about it. So I think it needs a lot more specificity in how it should be delivered. And also there need to be a lot more policies around so that the behaviour of boys, male teachers, is totally under scrutiny. I would think that all the male teachers should join the White Ribbon campaign and talk to the boys about the issue. People in the past, in some cases, the girls got the talk about carry keys when you go out, this is a rape alarm, all that sort of thing, or the police came in, and it would all be about the girls, this is how you protect yourself. It wasn't about boys, don't behave like this, and this is the reason why, and this is how you should be. And I think that's a really key thing. Mm-hmm. But I think that sometimes you have to be very, very particular about what is said.
Yeah.
And certainly it's something that in terms of the education in Leeds City Council, my colleague Jonathan, who's the executive member for schools at the moment is certainly looking at.
So yeah, Katie's just put in the chat, it kind of followed on from what you've just been discussing there, but I thought, well, I'll read out the question. So she's put, also on schools, prevention is better than cure. So how do you think we should approach educating boys to avoid them growing up with this sense of entitlement over women's attention and bodies? And I thought perhaps could you go into a bit more detail about the White Ribbon campaign and what their aims are with that, because I've heard some work in relation to that.
Yes, I think White Ribbon was started by a male youth worker in, I think, Hebden Bridge, but he might have been in Nottingham at the time. And he decided, for whatever reason, that it was time that men started stepping up and actually doing something to prevent violence against women, male violence against women. And it wasn't enough to just say, oh, yes, I agree with you, to their women friends or partners, and sort of keeping their own noses clean. So he'd started talking to the boys in the youth club about it, and then gradually got that further out in terms of youth work, and then further into making it the White Ribbon campaign as a campaign for men to join. And I think it can be very powerful. I was so pleased when the Leeds Rhinos and Leeds United, the teams, joined the White Ribbon campaign, went out into the middle of the pitch with their white ribbons on, and they'd made a video which was shown on the massive screens there to those huge crowds, which are mainly, a lot of men, with them all saying why they opposed violence against women and how bad it was. That is just so brilliant. Yeah. That's what we want to see. And I know not everybody has the reach, not every man has the reach of a Leeds United player, but any man can do something. And instead of just hearing something at work and going, oh, him, say something, do something about it. And we've had, during the 16 days of action against violence against women in November every year, not this last year because of COVID, but the 2 previous years, we organised stalls in the railway station and on Briggate, staffed by a couple of women, but also male councillors, and giving out white ribbons and trying to talk to men about the issue. And it's brilliant in the station. You get so many people stopping. It's really good. And I believe the White Ribbon group in Bristol, who were all men, went out and did that. So it'd be quite nice. I would like it if the men just did it. Yeah. I do not want to have to organise the stall. Yeah, I could be doing other things that would be more interesting than organising a stall and going through the railway authorities and everything. I want the men to take the lead and do it, basically.
Definitely. I think
not just turn up for 2 hours and think, oh, I've done my little bit for today.
Yeah, it's them initiating it that I think will be the real change. Us women are often always the organisers, exactly like this chat. And I think we're tired of it now,
really tired of it.
Exactly. Yeah. I think we need to see some charge taken by men, as you've said, and I think
we really do.
We will see change, isn't it?
We really do. I wouldn't be against a march of men. I believe that some man did say we'll have a march, not a Reclaim the Night for Men march, but a march against violence against women, and wanted a national march. Well, 52 men put their names down. But actually, if somebody wanted to organise, if a man wanted to organise that in Leeds, 52, that's still pretty good. You could walk through the streets of Leeds and give out leaflets, and 52 would, you'd notice it.
Yeah, definitely. I think I'm going to go to Maisie now. I think she had a question to ask.
Hi, yeah, sorry. Hi. Thank you so much for your talk as well. It was really interesting to listen to. I was going to pop it in the chat, but then I just kept typing away. I just wanted to ask what your opinion of, for the narrative of the way that things like Reclaim the Night activism has worked with the new police crime and sentencing bill, if that was to be passed, and the restrictions are being placed on kind of peaceful protests and on our ability to congregate in public spaces and stuff like that, and express our opinion. Do you worry that maybe the way that we've kind of achieved some of these things against violence against women will be harder to achieve because of that?
I think that is a very strong possibility, and I am really against that bill for that reason. I think I think the way that the in-person vigil in Leeds on the Monday night was policed was very sensitive, but we have not seen that in Clapham, we have not seen that in Manchester, and it's been appalling. But I think to enshrine in law that certain marches could go ahead, but certain ones couldn't, is wrong. And even if it's a march of, I don't know, the English Defence League, who I abhor, I still think they should be able to march, because we can then go and march against them. And be a lot more of us and show that they're not going to overcome. I don't think that banning that sort of thing by government is the way forward. I really don't. So no, I think it's a real danger. And this talk that marches are automatically disruptive, automatically lead to violence, or automatically really noisy and disturb people, I think it's rubbish myself. I mean, mainly marches take part, apart from Reclaim the Night, which doesn't happen every day, marches are on a Saturday afternoon and they're in the city centre, and they're not disturbing quiet residential streets in the middle of the night. It's ridiculous, really, in my opinion.
It's kind of the point as well of a protest, isn't it, for your voice to be heard and to disrupt things, and kind of taking that away
it absolutely is. I mean, this is a democracy in many ways, and I think it's anti-democratic. It's against the principles of democracy to have that sort of bill.
Thank you very much for that.
Thanks for your question, Maisie. I just want to go back to, I think Sophia put a comment in the chat about the discussion of undercover male cops in nightclubs, and she thought it personally makes me want to run in the other direction at the thought of undercover male cops in nightclubs. Sophia, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that. Don't worry if not.
Yeah, I think it's quite a widely held view, but I think if I knew that I was going, or I didn't know, and it was just kind of maybe something that was known that there would be male undercover, not just male, but police undercover cops in nightclubs, I would be even more anxious on a night out. I just would, because I feel like it would give in the first thing that comes to mind in my head is that it gives people a mask, or like a kind of disguise to do what they want. And so they would even and like I'm just very, it makes it naturally cynical, but because of the hour we've just had, the reasons why we should be cynical, but I think that's naturally where my mind would lead. So I wouldn't think that about a woman cop, but it's just naturally, so I think that's my opinion on it.
Yeah, I think that's been shared, a view that's shared by many. Certainly I know that I don't really go to gay clubs, but from the LGBT community who go to gay clubs, they're very against it, I've heard. And black people are not dead keen on it either, and there's reasons. There are reasons.
Exactly. Historic, aren't they?
Yeah.
And just as a follow-up question to that, actually, in terms of local government and central government, and these type of laws, I don't know, policies, would that be something that local councils or local governments would have control over? So, for example, if it was something that I don't know how all the governance works, but it was passed and Leeds were like, we don't feel comfortable doing that. Would you have jurisdiction to say we want to do it in our way?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it would be up to the senior police officers if they put women there, for example.
Right.
And we would very strongly say this is what should happen, because there are a lot of very well qualified female police officers who would do that job very well. So why not?
Yeah.
Yes.
It's been a big discussion for us in terms of LUU as an organisation, and when we return to activity, like our nightclub Fruity, And we were talking about the health and safety measures. You know, so much of this year there's been a lot to come to the surface, you know, around you know, hate crimes, you know, BLM movement, the Asian hate crimes, obviously violence against women. I think we're particularly aware that lots of students will be nervous to enter that space again, and we want to ensure that we support them in the best way possible. And I think the work you've done in training bar staff has been amazing in that sense. But more on, you know, thinking about the streets, because I know a lot of that has been around the discussion of women should be able to walk home at night alone. And I know I've seen a few clips of you talking about how men can do their bit to make us feel safer. Can you just talk through that a little bit here, you know, by them not walking right behind us and crossing the street? And because I think that's important for us, for men as well, who are going to watch this,
yes,
and educating them in how they can, you know, the littlest thing make us feel a little bit more comfortable.
That's right.
Going about our, you know, lives.
Yeah, well, I think that's a big thing, to not to walk sort of 10 paces behind a woman and maintain those 10 paces. And if the woman speeds up, and then the man speeds up, and that can be very alarming. The man can cross the road and then speed up as much as he likes and disappear out of sight. That's a sort of sensitivity I'd like to see. Or if there's a short kennel from just about diagonally opposite my house into the park, and if a man's coming one way down it, I'd probably wait at the end. Well, I would anyway for social distancing, but it's better if he doesn't then start coming down while I'm halfway there. So we're going to be sort of squashed between each other, and he's marching along and I have to push myself to the side, and I'm thinking, what might he do? And then avoiding just standing in a lurky sort of way. You know, think about the effect of what you're doing on other people. I think some men do find that rather hard, but in all sorts of ways. But I think that, and the White Ribbon campaign, the White Ribbon website has quite a lot of information as well, from which men can learn.
Yeah, I would encourage any men watching to definitely check out that campaign, because I think, as you say, the work they do is incredible in educating, and yeah, if you want to be a true ally, I guess,
yes,
to undertake that. I do wonder if anyone's got any final questions for Al, because I'm aware we've got about 10 minutes or so left, if anyone wants to pick anything up whilst we have Al here. But yeah, once again, just a huge thank you for joining us. I think you're truly an inspiration in terms of the women's rights movement.
Thank you.
And yeah, and I think yeah, as we said, we'll share this recording with our student community. I think I had one final question around, obviously, because you mentioned a bit back in 1977 at the start of the Reclaim the Night marches, you know, that what you only had, you know, a landline as your main form of communication. In Leeds, we have this group, I'm not sure if you're aware of it, called Leeds Student Group, where a lot of things get posted on there. A lot of women, especially, we've seen an increasing amount of posts on there about women just making other women aware of, you know, if they see a man on the street that seems a little bit dodgy, they'll post in there, kind of for safety elements, I think, which is amazing. But there's also been a lot of misogyny around that group, comments, and I just wondered whether it's an interesting one. Do you think social media has helped the cause of the movement of women's rights, or in some sense hindered? Because from the comments I was seeing today, the space in those posts was really uncomfortable to see, and men's comments, and because it's right there on your screen, you know, it's not necessarily you have to go to a nightclub and experience that. It's now right on our phones. So I just wondered what your thoughts are on that, and how you've seen the role of social media playing in all this.
Unfortunately, I'm not very positive about it either. I
Yeah.
mean, yes, it does mean that organising can be done more quickly, and we can all meet on a screen and all that sort of thing. And you can organise a vigil from one day to the next, without having a telephone tree that consists of people that you already know, and all sorts of people can join it. So there's, as a platform for communication, it has a great deal to recommend it. But as the sort of communication that you get is often really dire, and it puts certainly women off from having anything to do with it. And I think that is a really big failing in it, really big, and hideous. But again, there's something that men can do. They can jump in and, as men, disagree with that. And rather than thinking, oh dear, this is dreadful, but, you know, stepping back. But it is awful. It is absolutely awful. And it's very discouraging. Yeah. But not just in terms of this particular issue. Social media can be a discouraging sort of pit to jump into, really, sometimes.
Yeah. I think that we'd need another talk for that, Al, if we were going to delve into that. But yeah, I completely agree. I think, as you say, it is a great opportunity for men to stand up, and it's so accessible for men to speak their mind and support us in such an easy way. And I agree.
Yes.
Fabulous.
Yes, and it's surprising what funny things, some odd things some men think. Men who I think really should know better are coming out with, well, surely the men who behave like this have had very sad childhoods. Well, I'm afraid that an awful lot of men have had very sad childhoods, if we're going to look at that. No, it's not the case, you know.
Yeah. No, completely. And I think one final point I'll make as well is, I think you mentioned it in your talk as well, is the amount of a comment I seen on social media was the amount of women who know another woman who is being, you know, sexually harassed or, you know, had a violent act against her by a man, and the amount of men who don't know a single man in their friend group who have acted in that way. And I think that's where the issue lies, is that, okay, well, why is there such a disconnect between us as women, you know, speaking about that, and men not? And it's something has obviously got to change in that culture of men and their conversations and speaking about the actions towards women. But yeah, I think
definitely.
We'll leave it there then, and thank you once again for joining. I've really enjoyed it. I hope everyone else has. And yeah, I wish you all the best of luck with, you know, whatever projects you have coming up. Oh yes, before we leave, we've got an update from Sophia. Sorry, thank you for reminding me, Sophia.
Yes, great.
It's okay.
Yeah. Sophia, over to you to tell us about your work.
Yeah, no, I just thought it'd be handy, especially moving forward and keeping the city aligned. So at the University of Leeds, we've known this has been an issue for a really long time. And in my opinion, we are just as bad at, or just, you know, it occurs just as much as it does in Durham or in Warwick or in Exeter, but we just haven't had the unfortunate scandals that they have had. And I know this because, you know, as Lucy said, we all know someone, and that's enough to prove it. So when I came into this role, it was kind of pushing at an open door, which is always refreshing. You're not having to explain yourself over and over again. But instead of having conversations about it, we really wanted to ask the university to kind of put their money where their mouth was, as such. So obviously in higher education, it's a very prominent age for this to happen, and as we've kind of spoken about in secondary schools and teaching sexual harassment, we can see the inconsistencies that happen in the UK, let alone happen all over the world, where we've got varying laws and varying cultures. So when we come to the university, there's this huge gap of knowledge both home students and international students of what consent is, how to be an active bystander, and healthy relationships as well, where it comes into intimate partner violence, but also that's not always physical as well, and the emotional kind of abuse behind that. It's kind of preaches to the choir here. I don't really go into all the reasons, but one thing that we really, we've seen at the university and at the student union is we've seen time after time after time consent campaigns that kind of gather momentum for a week or two, and then they don't have that sustainability behind them. So when I came into the role, I really wanted to look at funding behind this, but not just funding into existing structures, but creating new structures as such. And so what myself and the head of student support, who's Chris Warrington at university, looked at how we could invest money. Oh, that's my cat. Invest money into this space by hiring expert staff who have got lots of experience in this area. And they've at Durham, for example, which have into their leading sector approach about 3 years down the line of their strategy in this. They have a dedicated role to sexual misconduct response and preventative managerial role. It's a very senior role. So we spoke to Clarissa Humphreys. She wrote this amazing book with a professor, Graham Towell, and we kind of took a lot of influence from their approach into what we would like to do at Leeds. And when we spoke to her, she said that her role was fundamental in the work that they've done in terms of creating preventative measures, creating better policies and procedures, but it was too stretched in workload. So when we came to kind of look back at our own community at Leeds, given the mass of students we have, 36,000 students, and that's not even counting staff, we thought we definitely need to create more capacity in this area, both in the student cases team, where the disciplinaries are happening and the accountability for actions are happening, but also in the preventative measures side, so we can be reactive efficiently, but proactively making a difference as well. And so we came up with this proposal, called it the Reformed Institutional-Wide Approach to Tackling Sexual Violence. We presented it to the Vice-Chancellor last week, Simone, and she was, as you can probably imagine, she's new to the university community, but she was very much on board with this, creating global citizens that go out and become model citizens, very much part of her strategic plan for the university, but also tackling gender-based violence as well. With that, combined with Sarah Everard, the unfortunate murder of Sarah Everard, and then the 8 months work we've done on this, it all kind of came at a really significant time, and quite timely in a weird way. So we presented that's gone down really well. So kind of had that endorsement from the Vice-Chancellor, which is really, really positive. And now the university, both in the student cases and the student support team, are looking at their budgets to create new roles in their teams to have leaders and senior leaders in this area that then will go on to create the preventative measures. So how we kind of envision that happening, it'll be beyond my time as well for officer, but it'd be like compulsory online consent courses for students when they are introduced to the university, but then looking, as you're saying, in terms of bystander training that you would have in bars, like ask for no, that's ask for Annie, I'm thinking of Andrea, and the ones that you'd have in taxis, but having similar ones offered to clubs and societies, the residence life teams, having them at school level, so every student would have an opportunity to opt in for them, and I kind of envision those kind of things being optional, because I think to create that collective kind of culture change, it's really good to have people leading by example, and I really do think we'd have the demand for it in our clubs and societies. I think they'd sign up very, very quickly for it. So it's a long-term plan, and I don't think that things like the consent training and the active bystander training are going to happen really, really quickly, but I think that I think everyone has understood that there's urgency behind the recruitment for these roles, and it's not until those roles are recruited that we'll have the capacity to then carry out those programs. So it's really exciting, and I think that we've got a lot of student accountability behind it. They really want to see this happen. Oh, thank you, Katie. But it would be really good to well, I'm going to be a student next year, so I'm going to make sure they do it as well. But I think it would be really good to kind of maybe for the LUU and the university and the city council as well, to maybe do like maybe in 6 months' time, see where it's at in terms of evaluation, and we can learn so many lessons from each other. I think our community alone could learn so much from the council and what they're doing, and linking it all up in a strategy that's combined. But yeah, it's been a journey, but I think hopefully we're on the track to progress.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. Really
Thank
good.
you.
Anything that you've got in writing about that, I'd love to.
Yes, I'll send you the report.
Oh, terrific. That would be really
Amazing.
great. Yes.
Oh, goodness. I feel like I'm giving it to a celebrity.
That's really good, because that's what it's about, isn't it? It's embedding those things in, not just having a one-off event or a little training course that then goes by the by, but actually embedding it into the whole structure of the university and the Students' Union and the way things work. And that's the way we really get change. So fantastic. Well done.
Thank you. No, I'll send it over to you today.
Brilliant, brilliant.
It's truly an amazing piece of work, and such an inspiring and positive note to end on, I think. So thank you so much for that, Sophia. And thank you again, Al, for joining us, and thank you everyone else for coming along and asking questions, getting involved in the discussion. That's what it's all about. And yeah, I hope you all have a lovely evening, catch the rest of the sun that's up.
Yes.
And
definitely.
Yeah, I'll see you all soon, and yeah, thanks again.
Thank you, and thank you so